Hi, everybody. This is Saturday night with Joe Firestone. In depth. My topic for tonight is paths to climate action in an era of soft and hard climate denial. And my guest, returning to Joe Firestone in depth, will be Michael Hoexter, who messaged me a couple of minutes ago saying he would be 2 minutes late. So I'm sure that we can wait for him for 2 minutes, or perhaps a little more. For background on Michael, he's been blogging for years at the New Economic Perspective site. On the environment and climate change and the relationship to MMT. He's a strong MMTer. He's a fellow at the Gonzaga Institute. He writes extremely well. And he's very exciting when he talks about the climate. He's had two previous appearances on our show. This is his third appearance, and I think he's back by popular demand because you all indicated that you wanted to hear more. And so while he's not here quite yet, I'm sure it will only be a few more minutes now. In the meantime, we can wait for us to fill up a little more. I like to wait until we're over 20 people. I think the sharing this weekend is something of a problem because we have Facebook jailing people again and also charging people with spam who simply are doing some normal sharing. Okay, perhaps when we're waiting for Michael, we can start with some questions. I've gone through a number of programs now recently where the programs, the time involved in the programs has been full. And so I haven't been able to do the Q&A sessions that I love so much. So if you have some questions now, I'll be happy to answer them as best I can. Okay, by the way, has anybody tuned in on my Twitter feed lately? It's been very active the last couple or 3 days. There are vigorous exchanges going on between the MMTers and the non-MMTers. And also vigorous exchanges going on the merits of Medicare for all, as opposed to alternatives to Medicare for all. There seem to be people who want to turn back the clock to 2009, who want to try different kinds of public options or a measured approach to Medicare, as if we haven't had enough fatalities already due to lack of insurance. Some people want to work with community health centers. There are people still doubting that taxes do not fund spending and who have to be persuaded that taxes do not fund spending. And a number of us have been involved in that. And so Michael is here now. He's in the lobby, and I'm going to bring him in. Oops. Okay, I guess he was in the lobby. His camera's on. Hi, Michael. How you doing?
Hello, Joe. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Sorry, I'm a little late. I was shopping. I I use my bike as much as I can, and so sometimes that means taking a little longer to do things, but happy to do it.
Okay, well, you're here now, and you're looking well,
Thank you.
and you look like the biking was good for you.
It's better than sitting behind a wheel in a car in terms of health, in terms of your physical well-being. So if you can manage it, if you have a place, you live near places where you can bike and the roads are not impassable, which they almost never are, it can work out.
Okay, terrific. So, okay, I started by introducing you and introducing our topic for tonight.
Okay.
Okay, I guess I'd like to start by turning it over to you.
Sure.
You suggested the topic.
Right.
And so can you tell us what you mean by paths to climate change?
Well, I mean, the title Paths to Climate Action in an Era of Soft and Hard Climate Denial. I'm trying to reflect as much as I can what used to be called the political conjuncture by some people on the left to try to bring our ideas that we, intellectual types like me and you and many people in the MMT community hold on to and develop over many years. But political time is different than intellectual time, and the discussion of ideas and so forth and so on. So I'm bringing ideas that I've had over the past, several years. I'm trying to bring that to focus tonight on what's happening now. In other words, what is the conjuncture? What is the political array of forces, and not just political, but also cultural array of forces, because much of climate action or any political action emerges from especially in the United States, but also many other countries, from a non-political social milieu of some kind. And in any case, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago now called, or a couple pieces on soft climate denial. And I think we discussed that maybe in our last talk or last talks.
Yes, we did.
And, but I will refresh people's memory about that. And basically I made a distinction in these pieces between hard and soft climate denial. And hard climate denial is what most people consider to be climate denial. It's what Donald Trump and Scott Pruitt and the Heartland Institute, the people who are Myron Abel, who's the Competitive Enterprise Institute, who's instrumental in bringing Scott Pruitt into the Trump administration. The hard climate denial is people who say either climate change is not happening, okay, or is not caused by human beings, or if it is happening and caused by human beings, that it is no big deal. In other words, that it's not something to be concerned about. And so now this position, it's evolved over time. In other words, the hard climate denialists have had to adapt to the more and more obvious disturbances in our climate. 2016 was the hottest year ever recorded in terms of global temperatures. And 2017 was the hottest non-El Nino year in terms of the global temperatures. And we're already, 2018 is already off to a really hot start. So, and we're noticing, I mean, in the East Coast right now, you have a full polar vortex that's come down, and it's one of the parts in the globe that is colder than normal or usual, but almost everywhere else it's hot, as it has been during the last polar vortex that occurred early in January in the eastern United States. So anyway, hard climate denialists are those people that most people identify as climate denialists. And anyway, so this new idea that I had, or I mean, I think other people have used the term before. I wasn't aware of their work when I wrote this piece, but anyway, soft climate denial, at least in my definition, is recognizing that intellectually that the climate is heating up due to human intervention, human emissions, human activity, mostly from fossil fuel emissions, also from land use changes, and that. But that soft climate denial is basically saying, compartmentalizing that knowledge and understanding, and saying, what can I do about it? What can I do about it is not even part of soft climate denial. It's more just simply compartmentalizing that, or embracing a neoliberal solution. And I'm calling them neoliberal. Some people might object to that use of that word. Solution basically saying the market we need to tweak the market using a carbon price, and we need to transition at some distant point in the future to a net zero emitting society, or a 20% of 1990 emissions society, which doesn't make any sense from the point of view of the situation we're in now, because 20% of 1990 emissions would still add to the heat burden of the atmosphere. Notice the atmosphere would still be capturing increasing amounts of heat at a time when we're already too hot. So anyway, basically, soft climate denial is sort of a Democratic Party version of climate denial, or a liberal version of climate denial, or an intellectual's version of climate denial, in the sense of saying, my life will continue. I don't really have anything to do about climate change in my life, or politically, other than entrust to people who are saying we need a carbon price, or we need a cap and trade system, or we need to divest from fossil fuel companies. Now, those are all, and actually, some of them are toxic things to do. They're bad things to do, anyway. But for instance, divesting from fossil fuel companies is not a bad idea, but it just is I guess I call it a thin tin whistle. So these are thin tin whistle policies that are not matching the dire picture painted by climate science and by weather people who report their weather. You don't even have to go as far as conferences of the AGU, or American Geophysical Union, or other climate science bodies to encounter information that tells you the climate is changing, and not just changing, heating up, becoming more volatile, more dangerous, more inhospitable to human prospering and human flourishing, and potentially for human life. So anyway, so soft climate denial is that type of climate denial. And sort of now stepping back, sort of on a broader, analogous, some of your listeners, some of your viewers might be, interested in climate action, but have other interests that are more paramount in their political or intellectual interests. But stepping back, now with the election of Trump, we have the reemergence of hard climate denial as really a very potent political force. Even though many people in the climate action community are scoffing, this is the last gasp of, the carbon lobby, this is the carbon bubble. I mean, there's a lot of terminology used to sort of make the re-entrance into the political arena of hard climate denial in a very strong way as something to be scoffed at, to be laughed at. These are the dinosaurs that are going to die soon. They're just having their last party, and that somehow automatically, the notion of a carbon bubble, for instance, the idea that the bubble will burst. It's like basically a Ponzi scheme of buying fossil fuels and using fossil fuels, and somehow it will collapse of its own. Okay, and there's some people who some people who are they don't see, I think, the role, in fact, of action. In other words, people have to act to make this happen. The idea of a carbon bubble, the idea of markets sort of their own transitioning us to clean energy is, I believe, I wish it were true. I mean, I wish it would happen like that, or I wish, that would be a force, a strong force. And in some areas of the world, in some parts of the world, there is already a transition going on, and even in the United States, or local governments are embracing, at least theoretically, 100% renewable energy. But I think it's more of a fight. In other words, I think it requires more action and more confrontation of the deniers, the hard climate deniers, as well as the soft climate deniers, or the people who are our own soft climate denial. I'm someone who thinks that we all have soft climate denial in different ways. I have soft climate denial. Other people, we can't avoid soft climate denial as in living in our society. We have an infrastructure that's dependent on fossil fuels, and an agricultural system that is dependent on fossil fuels, and also on land use, inefficient or destructive forms of land use. And so, we can't, it's hard to avoid, and maybe it's not even, unless, some people might devote their lives to creating their own personal virtue of being lower emitting, and that's fine, that's good. But not everybody can do that, and the system, it needs to be a systemic change in a lot of different things. So, anyway, stepping back again, I don't know if it's a tangent. I don't know if the thread is being lost, but basically, with the election of Trump in the United States, and then also we see some other developments in Europe and other parts of the world. We see the reemergence of a hardline stance toward what we call the neoliberal soft climate, or the Kyoto consensus, or the post-Kyoto consensus, or the Paris Accords. I mean, the Paris Accords really haven't kicked in, but in any case, we have the return of aggressive actors, political actors, on the side of fossil fuel use, and that requires us to rethink who are we focusing our energies on, who are we thinking about as our main opponents, and I see this happening, again, for people who are focused on other issues other than climate change. I see this happening on other levels. Like, we were all expecting in 2016 that Hillary Clinton would be elected to presidency until the very end, until essentially November, whatever it was, 7th. and it was a surprise. Okay, and I think that many people are still oriented toward thinking, well, the people we're mainly arguing against are, in my case, soft climate denialists, people who are promoting neoliberal climate solutions. But in fact, we're actually having to focus on the hard climate denialists who actually, in the United States, have now captured the apparatus of the state, and they are now using it to aggressively promote fossil fuel extraction, profligate use of fossil fuels, wasteful use of natural resources, basically laying waste to a lot of the, 40 years or so of, general environmentalism, and then, which is not the same thing as climate action or climate concern, but there is some relationship between that and climate action and climate concern, climate focus. Anyway, these people now run the show in the federal government, the federal level. So
yeah, but for a time anyway. But what are the paths to climate change?
I'm sorry, you're a little bit faint. I don't know, acoustically. I don't know if my speakers are low. Let me see. Let me turn my speakers up a little bit. Go ahead.
Yeah, the reason why was because I was getting some feedback, so I took off the earphones.
Okay, now I can hear you better. I turned up my speaker, my speakers. So please, what did you just say, Joe? What was the comment?
Okay, so the question is, okay, so you stated the problem well. What are the paths to climate action?
Well, there are a few paths to climate action, and I right now I can't pretend to give you all those paths, and it depends on not just me prescribing things, but people deciding they want to step on those paths. Because for me, and this is more of a general philosophical stance, the future is created by our performances as individuals and as groups. And that is not something that we as individuals can necessarily dictate what that performance will be. It has to do with our values, it has to do with our needs, it has to do with the objective situation of the world. But in terms of paths in the current situation where the federal government is not going to act on climate in any meaningful way with 99% certainty, okay, that local governments and are one area where we see, like for instance, the city government of Los Angeles has, or a councilman has gotten together with the group that I'm part of, the climate mobilization, and has declared that Los Angeles, this is when a councilman is terming out in Los Angeles, is declaring that Los Angeles will engage in a climate mobilization by itself. In other words, that so they will decide to act on climate as an emergency. In other words, the first step is to declare a climate emergency. So local governments could declare climate emergencies, and I think in general, I have been an advocate for the declaration of a climate emergency, even though there are dangers associated with asking for a declaration of emergency because of democratic rights and so forth and so on. But there's also a climate emergency, so we would need to be trying to safeguard our rights while at the same time advocating for a climate emergency declaration. So a climate emergency declaration is very important, and I think that it creates a context where actions by governments and actions by individuals become follow from the emergency. In other words, you know, if you like, for instance, a government, you know, like there's a fire. Okay, let me give you an example. There's a fire. Okay, if there's no fire and a bunch of fire trucks show up, it doesn't make any sense. It's like there's no reason to expend the dollars, and unfortunately, fire trucks use diesel fuel. But anyway, the diesel fuel to get the fire trucks to this particular location. But if, in fact, you have the 5-alarm fire, in other words, the fire, the emergency is there, you then have the actions of the city government or of the fire department become entirely logical, and furthermore logical. You also you can plan it. You can plan the paramedics. The paramedics come to if people are injured. You know, so there's a whole mobilization. In other words, a mobilization of resources. This is why the word mobilization is climate mobilization. There we are. So anyway, the word mobilization of resources, and this is why in MMT there is a affinity with MMT, because MMT prescribes or describes and prescribes the mobilization of real resources by governments, by the spending of money by governments, but particularly by the federal government, but any government. So in any case, emergency creates a rationale. Now the emergency is real. I'm not saying there are phony emergencies. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where we have a government now that's trying to create a phony emergency it appears to institute some kind of coup d'etat. Okay. And that's very alarming. And that should be, the phoniness of that emergency should be called out. Okay. But the climate emergency is a real emergency. There are reams of data supporting it. It's there. There are just too many people who are invested in the status quo or too comfortable or whatever it is, they don't want to recognize the emergency. And
question. Who declares the climate emergency in the Los Angeles area?
Well, I mean, it would be, right now it's a city councilman. The city council would be, but it would eventually be declared by the mayor, or the city council would ask the mayor to declare a climate emergency. It's an executive function. So an executive would be the person who would declare a climate emergency. But that, you know, that would be an example. In other words, Los Angeles is not the only place experiencing climate change. It's not the only place being negatively impacted by climate change, but it's an example of how governments other than the federal government can start creating a template for eventually what the action would be, or a partial template for what the action might be on a federal level once we no longer have climate deniers in office, if we are able to achieve that goal, which I hope we are. So, and right now, that's one path to climate action in that area, and that is, and that's one, important element, but it's not the only. So a climate emergency, for instance, let me take another area this is talking about municipal governments, about cities and streets. So municipal governments can have, along with their state governments, have responsibility for the streets,
yes,
or maintaining streets and roads, except for the interstates. And in any case, or the U.S. routes, the U.S. Highway system. So in any case, it's also well within their budgetary abilities to create a bicycle infrastructure that will make it easy for people to either use electric bikes or use tricycles if they are if they have trouble with their balance, or use regular bikes to get around if they so choose. Right now, in most of the United States, even though I said earlier in my intro that it's very few places that the streets are impassable, it takes a lot of courage right now to get on a bike on streets in the United States in most areas. And it requires a certain kind of hardy individual to do that, or someone who is so committed to biking, either because they love bikes, they enjoy the bicycle, they enjoy the freedom, they enjoy the air blowing through their whatever hair, so forth and so on. That not everybody can be expected to be that person, and the kind of bicycle. And unfortunately, the bicycle promotion community is in the United States is mostly people who are that hardy type of person, who are bicycle fanatics of different forms, and that's fine. That's good. That's good that they have that. It's a healthy obsession to have, but you can't expect everybody to have that kind of relationship to bicycling. Most people just want to get around. Most people don't care much about their car. They have a car, but they say, it's just a way that I get around to do the things I want to do. So we need to have cities and towns and states create a bike infrastructure that will enable what's called multimodal streets. In other words, people can use their cars, they can use their bikes, they can walk, they can use public transit safely on these streets, and they need to be it's a way to design streets so that's possible. And anyway, people talk about this as a good thing to do, so it's virtuous. In other words, I'm a good municipality because I've done this. I get brownie points, but that's okay. But we need to build these systems, basically, not just one multimodal street that you can do a ribbon cutting, and you can show the press and saying, look, Columbus, Ohio is a progressive city because we have this multimodal street, or, look at our bike lane, this one street. It's like, well, no, we need to create a usable network of bicycle infrastructure, so people will feel safe to bike, and their families send their kids to school on a bike. All these sort of things. Bike is a family, and it doesn't have to be only biking, but I'm using biking as an example of a low public investment level. It requires public investment, but not as high a level of public investment as some other important climate action activities. So anyway, in the context of a climate emergency, building a network of bike lanes becomes more important, or bike infrastructure or multimodal streets becomes more doable, because you're saying, look, we have an emergency, so we have to create our city so it can be viable in this emergency, rather than say, let's have a ribbon cutting about this green marquee project that we have on this one street or on these two streets. And so anyway, now some people might, I'm open to dialogue about, well, does that really work that way? Is that the way a city government could work, or a state government could work, in terms of declaring an emergency and then mobilizing the funds to do this? Is that the way to do it? And to me, at least, it seems like an obvious way to do it, or apropos of the current situation.
Okay, so could you name some cities that might have?
You're fading out, Joe. What did you say?
Can you name some cities that might actually do that?
Well, I mean, that's where, Los Angeles has taken a lead in cooperation with the climate mobilization to do that, and Los Angeles has been even before this action that was taken last year, this declaration by in the city council regarding a climate mobilization, basically it was a proposal of a climate mobilization for the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has, because of its traffic problem, been taking a relatively progressive view of public transit and building infrastructure of public transit relative to other cities like New York or even San Francisco, where I live near San Francisco here. So they have been more open to change. And I would say Southern California has a culture of being open to certain types of change. In other words, people are open to change in other ways in terms of their lives. People go there to sort of discover themselves or to invent the future in terms of their business. They go to, I invented the Mixmaster, whatever blender that will do wonders for your smoothie or something or whatever it is. So anyway, there's a culture of that even down there that's stronger than it is even up in the Bay Area. So anyway, I would say Los Angeles is one candidate. Maybe cities in Florida. Florida is with a Democratic mayor or liberal tendency of Miami. In other words, Florida is seeing sea level rise encroaching on its streets, so now it's hard to imagine what those cities will do to. It's quite dire in Florida.
Yes, it is.
And so what are the things the cities will do to at least have a lesser impact, even as the sea levels will continue to rise and endanger those cities. So, but in desperation, I think it requires a open dialogue for those people to really recognize this is the real situation, and this is where public dialogue. What do we do? Because we're with current trends in sea level rise, we're going to be floating soon here, and but those are areas where people should be open to doing something about it, and so I would say those are other areas where people want to do something. Maryland, where you live, there is a tradition of some progressive municipality, municipalities. My cousin lives in Tacoma Park, for instance. It's a very liberal little town, and there are other, like Berkeley, California. I don't actually. It might be a place that would do it. I even though I live near Berkeley, I don't see the activist base in Berkeley, unfortunately, for this kind of action. People here are too distracted by other issues that concern them other than climate change.
How's the situation up in Oregon and in Washington? Is there anything around Seattle?
Well, I would say Portland, Oregon is a city that might consider declaring a climate emergency. I'm not in touch with activists there who would be involved in that. I know there's certainly infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure, activism, anti-export, natural gas export terminals, and I mean, this is where I mean, one of the areas of where I've been critical of the so-called climate movement, or the movement that calls itself a climate movement, is that they have tended to focus so much on fossil fuel infrastructure and the local damages associated with the local dangers associated with fossil fuel infrastructure, that they've lost the climate portion of it. In other words, it becomes a local traditional environmentalist struggle, rather than a struggle about a global problem of climate. It's in the background. They understand that. So it is why this is part of what I call soft climate denial, in that they understand that there is a global problem, and due to the unseen odorless gases that come from fossil fuel combustion that we don't consider to be local pollutants, like carbon dioxide, but they tend to focus on the local pollutants. They're saying, okay, let this local pollutant, or the potential for those local pollutants to come in, and that distracts people from the global problem. I mean, they would think, well, no, there's no contradiction whatsoever. Everything is hunky-dory. But in my experience, it becomes simply, it's like pouring new wine in old bottles. It's saying the old bottle of environmentalism, NIMBYism, we call it, not in my backyard. Can be, it's poured in that old bottle, and people don't understand that, no, this is a new bottle, it's a new problem. It has to do with you. In other words, how you use those fossil fuels. It's not just the bad fossil fuel companies that are foisting it on you. It's like, no, you have to change society so we don't need those fossil fuel terminals. And and that, the fossil fuel companies are the main beneficiaries, instigators, funders of climate denial. And I wrote a piece a while ago about the degrees of climate responsibility for climate action, for climate catastrophe, degrees of responsibility. And they are there are people who are primarily responsible, the fossil fuel executives, the people at Exxon who in the 1970s or the 1980s decided to hide their fossil fuel, their climate research, that told them that in fact CO2 was leading to heating of the atmosphere and heating of the global climate, and they decided to lie about it. So that's all. Those people are primarily responsible in a way that you and I are not. Okay, but we are what I call secondarily responsible, in that it's incumbent on us to change our society to make us independent of fossil fuel use.
Okay, so there are the pathways you spoke of, but one pathway that seems to be fairly obvious at this point is to mobilize for the congressional elections of 2018 to support candidates who have climate change action very high on their agendas. Okay, and in fact, trying as hard as we can to commit the candidates to that as a priority that's very high on their agendas. Do you see that actually going on anywhere?
I would say that that's a good idea. There should be I am not part of a group doing that, but a group should be doing that, to create a climate scorecard for for candidates for Congress, and it's kind of it would be good, and it should be done. The only there are so many wish lists that people have for what the next Congress should do. And there's so many different. So I think that the climate movement should be focusing, as you say, more on what is the. So let me say first, climate movement, mostly not what I'm talking about. In other words, climate movement is mostly focused on divestment, to some degree on a carbon price, and opposing new fossil fuel infrastructure. None of which is bad, or the carbon price, if it's a cap and trade system, would be bad. Okay, but I'm not against carbon tax. The carbon tax, implemented well, could be good, but it isn't the silver bullet. It's not the only solution. But anyway, so the climate movement is not what I'm describing to you is a small group within the climate movement, the climate mobilization, maybe a couple other people outside it who are focused on essentially the federal government should mobilize, every government should mobilize in the form of a climate emergency at every level. That's a new thing. Now we should maybe have a climate emergency evaluation team or whatever to say, look, what is your stance on a climate emergency? And go to these candidates and say, are you willing to declare a climate emergency if you're elected to Congress, or sign on to a bill that's a climate emergency bill? So I'm responding to your suggestion or question or saying that may be a one way to do it, but there isn't when I say the climate movement is not unified, that we have most of the climate movement is neoliberal in the sense of and is also vaguely diffuse. So it's not even unifiedly neoliberal among, they're not reading whatever it is, the Chicago School or Hayek or whatever it is, and unified in some program. They simply are people who have been influenced by the neoliberal era to think of action as only being pressuring private companies to do the right thing, or individual consumers to do the right thing, or individual companies to do the right thing. And so they come out of that culture. So they don't have a culture of saying, no, let's demand the government act in a decisive way to invest in certain things and create a new reality for people.
Right. But certainly to get the government to do something like that, we cannot have the kind of Congress that we have now.
No.
Okay, so almost the first order of business is to get rid of this type of Congress, but to have a real revolution in Congress, so that a much higher percentage of the current people who hold office get swept out of Congress than we've been successful in doing in recent years. In other words, overwhelmingly, the incumbents still win. They still reflect the neoliberal perspectives. They're still primarily focused on their donors, and they still don't want to do very much when it comes to climate change. And you said yourself at the start of the program that we now have climate deniers in office who are hard climate deniers.
Yes.
And who are rapidly making things but far worse.
Yes.
Isn't the first order of business really to cripple these people in their efforts? And isn't the best way to cripple them to get a Congress that would be hostile to them? And
Well, yeah. Well, yes, yeah. I mean, I think that, I mean, that's you are capturing. You could take climate, you could take healthcare, you could take inequality. So economic inequality. It's really the same dilemma facing people like you and me, or people who are maybe who are in other. I've lost you in my. There you are. Okay. So there's a dilemma. It's like, are are we making the perfect the enemy of the good by just saying, well, let's just get some Democrat in there who sort of is saying, anyway, the current crop of people who are putting themselves up for Congress are motivated by a vast variety of opposition to Republican rule. Okay.
yes, they are. But I did not suggest that we get some Democrat in there.
Well,
What I suggested is that we get the incumbents out who are ignoring the problem of climate change, or actively promoting activities that are harmful to the climate and harmful to the
right. But to get them out, you need to get someone in. In other words, so
ecology.
You need to choose. You need to choose someone. In other words, to get them out, you just don't get them out unless they committed a crime, in which case you prosecute. You prosecute them or whatever it is. In other words, you impeach them in one form or another. But you would need to have the Democrat. In other words, if most of these people are Republicans, some of them are, like Joe Manchin is Democrat, and he needs to be gotten out as well. And there are some other Democrats, Mary Landrieu and so forth and so on, who are.
You're right, but in Joe Manchin's case, he has a very good candidate. I think her name is Norma Swearingen.
Right,
who's running against
Paula Swearingen.
Okay, Paula Swearingen, and she's running against him in the Democratic primary.
Right. Joe, what I'm trying to say though is that climate, the same issue. In other words, there is a mixed assortment of people. Paula Swearingen is one of the more progressive people who are putting themselves up for Congress. So these are individuals who've decided to take up the very difficult task of running for Congress out of a variety of motivations. We can, from the point of view of climate change and climate action, we could try to educate them and say, look, you have an obligation as a congressperson, or you should run on a platform of climate mobilization. Okay, let's call it. But that doesn't mean that there are so many, a diverse set of motivations that, and plus some of these people are standard neoliberal Democrats. Okay.
Yes.
Paula Swearingen is not. Okay. But they're, and so that would also be getting out the hard climate denialists. They would be soft climate denialists you'd be putting in. So in that way. So it depends on this diverse assortment of people that, so right now we are such a small group, at least the climate mobilization and other groups of similar interest and focus, or individuals of interest and focus. So we can only have an educational role. We can say, look, when you get into Congress, you should declare a climate emergency, and you should try to push for a climate mobilization. For me, I don't have it in terms of picking and choosing candidates. In some sense, we have a better chance of doing something at all by just picking whoever is the one or two people who really have a better shot from a point of view of succeeding in terms of getting the nomination for winning the primary, and then in the general, and then trying to educate those people. But it's such a unfortunately, even though climate change is this enormous issue that has all these implications for everything, okay, human survival, the meaning of all our lives, okay, that it is a very small, in the political discourse of the United States, is a tiny fraction of it, a tiny fraction. And so, and also the constituents, unfortunately, for the most part, are not that interested in it. Okay, and some are more interested than others. That's why, I propose a large-scale climate mobilization as an employment program, as a jobs program, as a new social contract, okay, for post-neoliberal or anti-neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, social contract.
Right, so part of the Green New Deal.
A Green New Deal, yes. There are many people who use the Green New Deal idea. I would, don't endorse everybody who uses the Green New Deal. Has been applied to a weaker version of what I would want to see. But yes, the idea of a new social contract, and a give and take. In other words, saying we are going to be making it more expensive for you to drive around in your dune buggy, okay? But we're going to be creating all these new opportunities for you.
Okay, so here's a question for you to consider. Okay, based on your knowledge of the kinds of things we can do to really have an impact on climate change, are there platform elements that we can formulate for candidates who start with a concern for the climate, a concern for the environment, to give them an electoral edge in 2018 if they advocate for certain policies?
You're saying give them electoral edge if they advocate for what I think is a good climate policy?
Okay, what I'm saying is if somebody's running on 5 to 10 specifics in their platform, can we isolate the specific policies that would have a favorable impact on climate change, that would also be popular, and that would give them an edge and help them to get elected? Okay, because I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. If we can give them a competitive edge with something, some policy, and of course, it's not going to be the same policy is not going to give them a competitive edge all over the country. Okay, there'll be policies that will give them a competitive edge in some districts, and other policies that are going to be a lot more popular, okay, in certain other districts. But I mean, if you're going to have an impact on congressional races, for the candidates who are running, it always comes down to what can I say or do or propose or campaign on that's going to give me a competitive edge over those who are running against me?
I have two responses to what you're saying. One of them is a specific response. The other is a more general reframing. Okay, and I'll start with the specific response. So, renewable energy is very popular with people in general. In other words, more so than energy efficiency, more so than some other things. It's renewable energy is part of the solution. Okay, it's not the silver bullet. I mean, it's necessary. It's critical. It's critically important, but it is also popular in the sense of in our local area, for instance, they advertise solar power by saying this guy on TV is saying, you know, I have solar panels, and you know, my wife complains about me leaving the light on, but I know that it's okay because I have solar power. You know, and it's like, so I mean, they're sort of promoting wastefulness because they have solar power, and you know, and that is Tesla Motors, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, in Tesla, which owns Solar City, where I used to work, actually, and is now part of, it's been integrated into Tesla, has basically a carefree attitude toward, well, it's just about consuming the right things. In other words, it's just about consuming the right car, having the right, house, the right roof, having the right products, and you just live your lifestyle the way you always did. And unfortunately, that doesn't work for everybody, and it won't work for our system as a whole. But anyway, renewable energy. Anyway, to get back to answering your question, renewable energy is very popular, and in many areas of the country, and so you can make a case. And renewable energy generates more jobs, even without its current relatively anemic, though it's actually growing rapidly, or has been growing rapidly, with the current system of incentives and so forth and so on, which may be cut, which the Trump administration is trying to undermine as much as it can. But anyway, so a candidate can right now by being aggressively pro-renewable energy, can add to their image as being a job creator or a job promoter by saying, we're wholly into doing 100% renewable energy because it will generate lots of jobs. Okay, and so that's an edge that can be gotten by candidates, and it's not something. And renewable energy, in a way, even though it's tangentially related to climate change, and it isn't actually it's just it's a form of getting energy that in most cases has zero or net zero, can have net zero emissions in operation. Okay, so and so it's a critical part of the solution that we have for climate change, but it isn't necessarily. You don't have to mention climate to be pro renewable energy. So, but the other thing, the reframing that I want to bring up, okay, is there's a general, I would say, the general problem, and you encounter this not just with climate, but with people who say we need a federal job guarantee, or we need we need to have a $20 minimum wage, or we need to, any, or Medicare for all. Okay. In other words, people need to embrace government as a positive contributor to their welfare. Okay. And that they need to have a sense of hope that government can help solve their problems. Not all their problems, but it can help solve many of their problems. Okay? And that is not at all apparent to many people right now. And that is a critical piece. Okay? I would say that's a precondition for people to embrace a climate mobilization, embrace a job guarantee, embrace a Medicare for all. In other words, they need to feel like a sense of hope more generally, that general hope, just hope. Unfortunately, Mr. Obama raised people's hopes and then disappointed them, and used the word hope in a way that made it politically loaded right now. But people do need hope of some kind, and they also need to attach that hope to a social, collective action of some kind, with government involved in it. This is not apparent. I mean, Joe, you grew up in an era where that was obvious, okay? But it's not obvious to people now. It needs to be
I understand.
It needs to be
it's not obvious to people now, Mike.
Not obvious. So
okay, and I know that one reason why it's not obvious to people is because the politicians, okay, on both sides, do not propose to people specific programs, specific measures, which people can look at and say, that's going to solve my problem. Okay, in other words, to hell with the generalities. I don't care anymore about people who tell me jobs, jobs, jobs. What I want now is people who are going to tell me specifically what they're going to do to create those jobs, and do it in such a way that I can see that if I put in enough people like them, that it will be possible to get these things through Congress. It will be possible to make it happen.
Sure.
But this afternoon, I had a Twitter exchange with somebody. It was quite an extended exchange. But we got involved in talking about a Medicare for All program. Okay, and he started basically temporizing. He wasn't really for a Medicare for All program. He was living back in 2009, where he thought that an incremental approach would be acceptable to people. So he talked about things like, well, it would be a good start if we lowered the Medicare eligibility age by 5 years, okay, or if we did such and such to lower costs. So he kept on coming up with incremental things that could be done that seemed like they were realistic to him. From my point of view, however, they were profoundly unrealistic. And the reason why they were is nothing will be done anyway until we once again elect a progressive Congress. On the other hand, in order to elect a progressive Congress, we have to give people a hope, as you say. And how can we give people hope if we're proposing to them policies which they can plainly see are only going to produce extremely incremental changes that don't really impact their lives very much? I mean, as long as that's what we're offering because we think that that's all that's practical in the world as it is, we'll never get people to hope again, and we'll never get the kinds of actual majorities in Congress that we need to change the situation. So we have a chicken-egg problem. We have to stop looking towards the past, stop looking at the present, and start looking at what could be. And until that happens, I don't think that ingredient of hope is going to be injected into the situation.
Well, you know, all I'm saying is that to propose if we just make it a matter of tech, if you just propose a program of some kind, for instance, I say, I'm for a climate mobilization. Okay, let's say a full-scale climate mobilization to transition within 15 years into net zero emitting society. And you've seen I've produced some, 10 years, 15 years. 10 years should be, but let's say 15 years. Okay, it's a huge multi-trillion, multi-trillion dollar.
It's your $4 to $6 trillion a year project.
Right. And so, and
I love that project, by the way.
Yeah, it's great. So, but I need to recognize that a prerequisite for people to even embrace that idea is that they feel a sense of hope. Okay.
No.
Well, no. But Joe, I think that no, and proposing. I'm not saying not to propose the idea. I'm not saying not, but to also simultaneously understand that people will have resistance to recognizing it.
And they will have skepticism. They will have skepticism.
They will have objections. They saying, I've been burned before. People talk about pie in the sky things. We've been burned recently. I mean, in some sense, we have Trump in part because people felt burned by Obama to some degree. I mean, there's other reasons, but essentially, interestingly, you've seen that INET study about how the dark money flooding into in October of 2016 for Trump, huge amounts of dark money. So there was a shift in the American ruling class, the billionaire class, about who they really wanted to win this election in the middle of 2016. So, or the end of 2016. But I think that to propose big ideas and big programs, you need to understand that people, are not used to this. They're not used to it right now. The younger people in particular. Younger people are shut their ears often to, they're nowhere near the New Deal in terms of their experience. They've only experienced the gradual undoing of the New Deal. Yes, many of them have embraced Bernie Sanders. Some of them have gone to DSA. Okay, but it's still. I would like to see Bernie is in some ways, very conservative proposer of new ideas, and so I mean he's been in the Senate for so long, and he's sort of the amendment king. I mean he's been the only democratic socialist in his body, conservative body essentially, for a long time, and so he's not quite even though people think of him as a firebrand, he's not really a firebrand, in that, and so I mean I support many of the things he's doing, and he's a force for good, and I appreciate that he's been doing what he's doing. I campaigned for him, a lot of things that are good about him.
Sure.
But in terms of like the whole idea of a climate mobilization, maybe he will come around to proposing a climate mobilization. I hope he does. But he's not leading on that. Certainly, he had the better positions on climate in the 2016 election. But anyway, so yeah, we have people who are just sort of generally many younger people are sort of saying, yes, I want something different. I'm being left out of the party in the sense of economically, I'm being left out of the party. I want government to do something for me. We have a sector of young people who are saying that. But I think that like climate mobilization involves, it doesn't involve just what might call pro-appetitive things, appetitive being the appetites, in other words, getting things. It also involves some sacrifice, some things, giving up some things, and so it's harder. It's harder for people to embrace that idea. It's not quite the saying, Medicare for all. It's like I get health insurance when I didn't have it before, and I'm getting stuff for me. It's whatever. I haven't gotten things, now I'm getting something, and it's easier to embrace that way. So
right, but of course, if you're going to spend $4 to $6 trillion a year on a mobilization like that, then there are going to be jobs for everybody.
Right. Well, no.
People are going to get jobs, and they're going to get careers.
Well, I totally agree. That's why I proposed it. It requires a publication, and it requires a megaphone. I don't have that megaphone. Maybe whatever, of saying, look, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to do. This will create meaningful jobs for you for decades to come, so forth and so on. This is whatever. This is a way to pull away at least some segment of the sort of angry working class, mostly some white, some non-white, but who are fed up with the Democrats and who were disappointed with them and so forth and so on, and just also create a real positive policy agenda that can do the things that people want. In other words, the job guarantee. In other words, the idea of a job guarantee, doing what kind of jobs would you do in the job guarantee? Well, you could do things related to this climate mobilization. So it creates a reason or a direction for the federal spending and the creation of a real economy or a different real economy.
Right, and
that everybody celebrates in the left, or people celebrate in the liberal left, but they don't create. It's a diagram. It's a design for it, and I would love it that it would be publicized and made more. I'm open to ideas about how to make it expand the reach of it, so people are. It's embraced by politicians, because it is a risk for them to do that. It involves it's a leap. It involves a shift. So a shift in the way people. You're saying, look, we got to do. We're not just going to be continuing on in the way that we have been for the last few decades. We're going to change.
Okay, so, I agree.
Joe, you said that you wanted me for an hour, and we're a little over an hour. How do you want to wrap up?
Okay, why don't we wrap up with you making a final statement? Okay, and then, of course, it'll be possible to have you back again sometime in the future, if you like.
Sure.
As well, and we can continue this discussion, which is a very important one, I think. So, would you like to wrap up then with a final statement?
Oh, okay. I mean, I didn't say we have to, unless you wanted to add something, Joe, to the current conversation before I wrap up. I'm not saying end at this point, but did you wanted to add something to what the thoughts you were having, or do you want to?
Well, the only thing I wanted to add is that we have one of our 7 knowledge policy areas here, okay, is the area of environmental, and ecological justice.
Mm-hmm.
And
who's here? What's here?
Here is the Real Progressives group.
Oh, okay.
Okay. We have 7 areas that run through all the efforts that we are currently either performing or planning to perform.
Okay.
We're now primarily focused on getting a media pillar off the ground, incorporated, and also funded. And the reason for that is that we're very far along with what we need to do that kind of thing, due to our live streams and graphics, okay, and our ability to share posts and such. We already have the elements for such an effort together. We're proceeding on an activism route with a tentative alliance that we're currently pushing extremely hard to make a permanent alliance with a group that's pushing a contract for American renewal, the CFAR. And they are in the process of committing congressional candidates all over the country to CFAR in time for the 2018 campaign. And we've also done some work in putting together a policy pillar and an education pillar. And the policy pillar, at least in theory, is there to drive the other pillars with the ideas and policies that are generated by the policy pillar. And while the work on the policy pillar has been somewhat in abeyance, but because of our necessary focus on the media pillar, okay, at this point, I'm sure that it will be taken up again fairly shortly, okay, and at that point, we need good people who are heading up the knowledge areas. Okay, now my particular knowledge area is the democracy knowledge area. So I range across a number, okay, of knowledge areas now. But we would really love someone highly qualified to be the director of the environmental and ecological justice area. Okay? And if you would like to do that, I'm sure that it would be possible to have a regular program with us where you would be able to push your agenda
right
on a weekly basis, or even more frequently than that.
right
You'd be able to formulate your agenda and also push your agenda. Okay, and I think that there are quite a lot of us who'd be really interested in having you join us.
Right. Well, Joe, I mean, we've discussed this already offline. I mean, I would appreciate that we would do this not online in a live discussion with.
Yeah, I know, but you asked me what I was thinking.
But anyway, I think that I would appreciate having that discussion, offline.
Okay.
But anyway, and we've already had a part of that discussion. Yes. The one thing, and this is something for real progressives and for anybody, any intellectual group with an intellectual interest, okay, is that finding effective action is the most important thing, okay? All right, and having discussions and talk shows, and me talking even, I'm including myself in this, including my own propensity to write. I write for New Economic Perspectives, occasionally get republished at Naked Capitalism. Yeah, I've been published in some other areas at some Grist and so forth and so on, and at an earlier point in time. I self-publish some. I have a blog, a couple of different blogs that I publish, self-publish in unrelated areas, unrelated to the focus of New Economic Perspectives, though New Economic Perspectives is pretty liberal in terms of allowing topics. And I'm writing something now which we discussed about nihilism, and which is a concern of mine, related to hope, related to what we're talking about right now in terms of hope and how hopeful people feel. and whether they feel like we can have constructive change overall. Okay. But anyway, my concern is in general is how our words and talking can lead to effective action. You know, you proposed something today that could potentially be, if there were the bandwidth for people to at least pressure candidates for Congress to focus more on a climate agenda or on effective climate action. It sounds like a great idea, something to think about, you know, as an action that is outward looking toward candidates and then toward voters of different to publicize an agenda of focusing on a climate emergency. Okay. So anyway, so I guess in terms of a summary, I would say I want to think about this for myself in terms of my words and how I can do things. I find myself frustrated by the lack of action. Okay.
Yeah, so do I.
People are taking. Okay. And also the diffusion of action, the fusion of different groups that you have that are trying to either get your money or get your time, and to do something that is more or less better than what Trump is doing or what the GOP are doing, you know, or opposed to it in some form or other. But they take you in about 15 or 20 different directions. Okay. And right now, I think we're at a point in time where our democracy is, or our government, our institutions are at a point of crisis. Okay. Only tangentially related, unfortunately, to climate change. And this crisis of those institutions is a critical time that calls people to think about what it is that they can do. And at least that's my perspective. So in summarizing, I think that as much as we have, I think I mentioned this in the beginning, we have longstanding intellectual interest. I have longstanding intellectual, political, social, environmental, existential interests. But also we have a critical conjuncture, and this conjuncture is very concerning and very.
Yes, it is. Okay, but you said earlier that that you don't have a megaphone. Okay, and I heard that kind of loud and clear. Okay, and what I'm saying is that you can begin to have a megaphone here, and to increase the loudness of the megaphone
Joe,
as time goes on.
Joe, I think I already expressed my preference for having this conversation where we would like to have this conversation. I think I already expressed that to you, right? Okay. Okay. All right. In any case, megaphone is not. I mean, I have 1,300 followers on Twitter. Not everyone reads my tweets. You know, I could write more. Okay, I can get my writing out there in ways, if I work on it, to have a larger megaphone. The megaphone part is not my main concern. Okay, it's more about directing, and this is something that other people, not just me, and with my concerns, but with their concerns. How do you direct your energy right now to prevent a collapse of American institutions? Okay, and all of these are it's a critical point in time that I see people continuing on using their megaphones that are much larger than mine talking journalists and what have you, left-wing journalists and whatever, continuing on their rap. Okay, so, and it's more about, you know, how do we act now? You know, do we take to the streets? Do we? What is it? How do we direct our energies to make sure we have a democracy in the next several years? So, and while also, I think doesn't exclude continuing to work for climate mobilization, climate emergency declaration, all these different things. So anyway, that's my closing statement, so to speak, today.
Okay, Mike.
I believe it's it's apropos and focused on, as I was saying earlier, the conjuncture. Okay.
Okay, I agree. Okay, thank you, Mike.
Okay. All right.
For coming back and for a discussion. That was a great interest.
Okay. All right, Joe.
Okay, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Okay, okay, Joe. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, takes a second to end this.